Well, thank you very much, Deborah. As someone once said, that's the sort of introduction that my father would have enjoyed and my mother would have believed. I didn't realise it had so many names. That's incredible. Well, good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here amongst so many friends for this important conference, and I'm honoured to have been asked to talk to you at such a key gathering and at such a crucial time. I can't help reflecting as we enter the year that marks the centenary of the First World War that the international situation today is in many ways as complex, intractable and dangerous as it was in 1914. It's true that we live in a very different world from that of a century ago, and that, for good or ill, many things have changed. But while history may never repeat itself exactly, it does have a nasty habit of turning up again in slightly different clothing. There are many resonances between the pre-Great War world and the one of today. The fading of old powers and the rise of new ones, the quarrelling over disputed territory, the violent tendencies of radical non-state actors, the need to provide sops to difficult domestic audiences. All of these are themes that one can see in the Europe of the early 20th century and the world of today. And certainly no one in this audience needs me to remind them that many of the current issues in the Middle East arose out of the collapse of Ottoman rule at the end of the First World War. One of the things that is, however, very different in 2014 is Britain's relative position in the world. In 1914 it was no longer perhaps the dominant power that it had been for most of the 19th century, but it was still at the forefront when it came to global influence. And that, of course, is why its fingerprints are over so much of the post-1918 settlement, the unravelling of which is causing us such concern today. But the United Kingdom has the world's 6th largest economy. An economy that, thank heavens, seems to be on the move again after the travails of recent years. And that economy relies upon extensive international trade in goods and services and upon a reasonable degree of global stability, or at least predictability, to enable such trade. Its organs of soft power have global reach, and it is one of the few nations that possesses armed forces capable of undertaking serious missions over a wide area. It would be a mistake to interpret, as some have done, the recent parliamentary vote against military intervention in Syria, for example, as a general unwillingness in the UK to employ military force. In the first place, the government would have won the vote, but for some bad parliamentary arithmetic. And in the second place, the vote was not against the principle of military intervention, but against a proposition that was of disputed legality and that looked less like a plan of action and more like activity in search of a plan. So, for reasons of pragmatic policy, as well as historical association, the UK needs to and will remain an active participant on the international stage. But given the nature and location of this conference, it's only natural that I focus for a moment more narrowly on the relationship between Israel and the UK. Now, I want to be clear. I do not stand here as a representative of the British government, nor do I necessarily reflect its views. My observations and thoughts are my own. But over my 4.5 decades of service and experience in the UK and many other parts of the world, I have come to some conclusions of my own, and I have to some extent been able to gauge the degree to which such conclusions are shared or rejected by my fellow citizens. So I most certainly cannot claim to speak formally for my country, but I can, I think, give you a view that, while personal, goes some way beyond the merely individual. And to do that, let me start by stepping back in time just a little way. I joined the Royal Air Force on the 1st of April 1968. Now, there are two things that, to my mind, are significant about that date. The first is that it was the 50th anniversary of the formation of the Royal Air Force, which was itself born from the fires of the First World War. Rather an auspicious starting point for a career, one might think. But the second thing was that it was All Fool's Day, which perhaps should have told me something about what I was getting into. I would perhaps have learnt what many of us in this room know all too well, that you cannot survive the military life without a really good sense of humour. But the spring of 1968 was also less than a year after the Six-Day War, and more than 5 years before the Yom Kippur War. So the early part of my military service and experience spanned that particular period of this country's history. And I have to tell you that in those days, I and my colleagues held Israel and the Israeli Defense Forces in particular in the highest regard, and even perhaps in some awe. The sight of a small nation beset by enemies on all sides, defending itself with such courage, skill and sacrifice, stirred in us a sense of sympathy and of deep admiration. And this feeling was not limited just to the UK military establishment. The British have always had a particular regard and affection for what they perceive as plucky underdogs, and Israel's plight caught the popular imagination. I wouldn't want to suggest for one moment that there were no contrary voices, but the sense of admiration of and support for Israel was very clear to me over those years. Today seems to be rather a different story. Indeed, some of my Israeli friends tell me that they see the current UK attitude towards Israel as leaning to the anti-side of neutral. Well, while acknowledging that much has changed, I'm not sure that this characterization is the right one. And let me try and explain why I say this. Israel is no longer perceived as besieged. As people say, it has in some ways gone from being David to being Goliath. This is in many respects a measure of its success over the last few decades. But it has, as a consequence, lost the automatic sympathy vote. This may be perceived as unfair, but in my experience, the world is not a very fair place. The result is that, in the UK at least, Israel's actions can be subject to detailed scrutiny and sometimes to serious criticism. Now, I am making no judgments about whether such criticisms are fair or not. To my mind, the critics all too often oversimplify the issues and sadly misjudge their language. But the fact of such criticism remains. Does this mean then that sentiment in the UK does at heart tend to be somewhat against Israel? Well, the answer is no. Let's just reflect for a moment. The ancient Hebrews were one of the wellsprings of modern Western thought and philosophy. Ideas of monotheism and justice tempered by compassion have come down to us alongside Greek thought and ideals to shape our lives in the West today. As I heard one lecturer say, even if you're an atheist, it's the God of Abraham you don't believe in. The existence or otherwise of Zeus or Baal simply isn't a live issue. This cultural and intellectual heritage may not be something that we consciously acknowledge, but it's in our metaphorical DNA. But beyond this, Israel is a democracy. Its basic political values are those that we share and cherish in the UK, and for which we have fought in so many places and times. It's a modern scientific and industrial state with business links throughout the world, not least in the UK. The two countries have intellectual and physical connections that give them a high degree of common interest, and this, at heart, creates a bond that cannot easily be severed. So there is, beneath any surface turmoil or short-term disturbance, still an underlying support in the UK for what Israel is and what it ultimately stands for. Such support can be tapped or ignored, but it cannot be disinvented. Does it matter, though? Should Israel or the UK care about such a relationship and the need to nurture it? I cannot speak for Israel, but on this matter at least I most certainly can answer for my own country. For the UK, the answer is emphatically yes. The relationship is of great importance to us. I've already outlined the extent to which the UK is engaged internationally and the historical, political and economic imperatives that drive such engagement. And within that wider context, this region is crucial to our security and prosperity. It really matters. It matters not just because of energy, although that clearly is a major factor in our considerations. It matters because instability in this region has a significant impact on trade and finance. It matters because it contains the heart of Islam, and we have many Muslim UK citizens. And it matters because insecurity in this region quickly manifests itself as insecurity in the UK. It is, in a very real sense, our security front doorstep. Some of my friends ask me if the UK truly sees the Iranian nuclear programme as a national security issue rather than just as a complex problem in international diplomacy. Again, the answer is it most certainly does. Iran's programme may not be quite the pressing existential threat to the UK that it is to Israel, but the dangers it poses to regional stability and the very serious risks of wider nuclear proliferation worry us greatly. We may see some things from slightly different angles, but those angles are nearly always on the same side of the issue. So this region is important to us, and within this region, Israel is a key player. It also, as I've said, shares our fundamental values and philosophy. So Israel is a natural partner for the UK on all sorts of matters, but especially when it comes to security. So let me turn to three particular areas where I believe we urgently need a degree of common understanding, if not always an identical opinion. And the first must be Iran's nuclear programme. I've already set out some of the reasons why the UK regards this as a serious security threat. So what is to be done? Well, we do, I think, agree that the best outcome is to end the programme without resource to armed force. Sanctions and other non-military pressures were imposed in an attempt to get Iran to negotiate, and to that extent they have succeeded. Naturally, there are concerns about giving away too much too quickly, and thereby discarding the very negotiating leverage that we've so painstakingly built up over a number of years. But if our aim is to achieve a negotiated settlement, then we have to be prepared to negotiate. Of course, we have to negotiate well if we are to achieve the right outcome. And of course, we must take nothing on trust. Any agreement has to be verifiable. There will inevitably be different views on what constitutes a bad deal or a good deal. But I want to focus on just two short-term issues that seem to me to be of fundamental importance in this whole process. The first is the sustainment of the agreed sanctions regime. There is a clear risk that as negotiations continue and some restrictions are lifted, sanctions as a whole will start to unravel. There will be a temptation for some countries or companies to jump the gun in order to gain a competitive advantage over their rivals. This is a risk that cannot be entirely eliminated, so it will have to be managed. It will require strong and obvious resolve on the part of the major economic players to take firm and painful action against any transgressors. And the earlier this is made clear, the better. Deterrence is far preferable to post facto punishment, although the former clearly depends on the credibility of the latter. And the UK and the EU more generally will have an important part to play here. The other issue concerns the question of where we go if negotiations fail. What is Plan B? In such situations, there is often a reluctance to consider Plan B at all, in case this is taken as a belief that Plan A will not work. But such precautionary thinking does not need to be public. We can and should discreetly be considering what options are open to us if it proves impossible, even with additional time, to reach a comprehensive settlement. This will inevitably involve some difficult decisions, but leaving them to the last minute risks making the difficult impossible. And of course, the implicit existence of a Plan B could help to focus minds on reaching a satisfactory agreement in the first place. The second area I want to touch on is the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Now, I do not intend to try and tell this audience what Israel should or should not do. I've tried hard to understand the complex issues involved, but if I've gained any wisdom at all in the process, it is of the Socratic variety. I at least have an idea of the limits to my knowledge. But I would just like to make 2 points. The first is the overriding need to provide adequately for Israel's future security. The pre-1967 borders were clearly a strategic nightmare. The nature of the security threat may have changed over the years, but the issue remains of fundamental importance. A settlement that does not sufficiently address security cannot, in my view, endure. I'm of course aware of the problems, and I know that Israel does not wish to place its security in the hands of others. And I have considerable sympathy with that stance. Frankly, I would view the participation of third parties in what one might term hard defence as unwise. But some form of international involvement may prove necessary outside Israel's borders, and if that turns out to be the case, then it's worth bearing in mind that the UK has a very capable military which, along with others, may be able to bring something to the table without compromising Israel's defensive capability. My second point concerns the question of settlement expansion. Now again, I have no desire to suggest what Israel should do on this issue, which I know is more complex than many observers imagine. I will simply point out what I'm sure you already know, that it is damaging Israel's public image, certainly in the UK and more widely in the international community. Israel may well decide that this is okay, that it can live with the consequences. That is, of course, entirely for it to decide. But Israel may also want to consider whether a more nuanced policy in this area would serve its wider national and security interests. Finally, I want to say a word or two on security developments in the wider region. The term Arab Spring seems happily to be losing its appeal. But what I think is clear is that we are seeing the unravelling of the post-1918 settlement that was intended to tidy up the detritus of the Ottoman Empire. Many of the cards are now up in the air again, and we have no clear idea of where they will fall. What is evident is that the changes are posing and will continue to pose serious security challenges. Some believe that the many divisions throughout the region are leading to a weakening of state boundaries. Well, perhaps so. But I, for one, do not believe that changing these boundaries will resolve the real issues. It will simply move the points of contention. The search for political settlements that might help to satisfy the many competing and often contradictory demands of different groups is, of course, crucial. But as part of this, it may be worth putting renewed effort into some form of regional economic development. I'm often struck by the fact that the European coal and steel community of the 1950s, which was one of the seeds of the European Union, was an economic construct aimed at a political problem, the long-term enmity between Germany and France. I would not be so bold as to suggest a similar arrangement in this region, and of course the situations are not exactly parallel. Some people believe that the politics must precede the economics. But the most desperate need in so many countries is employment for young people. Any activity aimed at this particular problem can only have a beneficial effect on longer-term security. And Israel, of course, is one of the few regional states that could convincingly underpin such an enterprise. I know that this approach has been tried before and that it has been undermined by old suspicions and enmities. But perhaps the time is right to try again, supported by investment commitments from the EU and other members of the international community. Which leads me to a final thought. Israel is historically and geographically a country of the Middle East. But as I've said, its underpinning currents of thought form a significant foundation for Western philosophy and ideas more generally. Its political and economic processes are closely aligned with the West. So there is a strong argument that in many important ways Israel is at the eastern edge of Europe rather than at the western edge of the Middle East. A closer alignment, both informal and perhaps formal, with Europe would bring great benefits to both sides. And it would also help to provide a more effective diplomatic and economic conduit into the Middle East. Now, I don't have time this evening to develop this idea further, but given the importance that the United Kingdom attaches to its relationship with Israel, it is something that would clearly have great attractions for us. I have no doubt that Israel's relationship with the United States will remain of primary importance, but it certainly need not be exclusive. The implications of America's so-called pivot to the Asia-Pacific region have, in my view, been somewhat exaggerated. But it surely reinforces the importance of those of us who live in this part of the world drawing together more closely. And in any event, it seems to me only appropriate that the nation that in many ways invented the West some 3,000 years ago should play a major role in sustaining and advancing its values into the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.